For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Mali. Joining me today is Kate Sidley, here to discuss the book 100 Mandela Moments. There have been many books written about Nelson Mandela. What do you think is your book's unique contribution?
Well, the brief for this book was to do something that was accessible to a broad audience. There are lots of wonderful books, and believe me, I've read most of them in the last few months. Lots of lovely books about Madiba. This one, 100 Mandela Moments, what it is 100 stories, 100 short stories, and each of the stories is just a couple of pages long. So you can dip into it. If you read it from beginning to end, it's loosely chronological, so you do get a biography, basically. But each story is a standalone story, and it's meant to be something that anyone can read. Not everyone's up for a 500-page, biography, and the style of it is supposed to be quite light. So even though some of the stories are quite heartrending, some of them are more poignant, some of them are more gently amusing, and so on. But the actual style of writing is very accessible. So I'm hoping that that young people can read it who maybe haven't been exposed to a lot of the other books. And maybe would benefit from knowing more about Madiba. I think anyone could enjoy this book. People who are visiting from overseas and who want to know more about him. So that's what we're hoping is our contribution.
And because there's a lot of information available, how did you go about researching the book, and who did you speak to?
There were two basic ways of doing it. The one is that I read a lot of books about him. I read obviously his own work, Long Walk to Freedom being the main one, and then the newer one, Dare Not Linger, which Mandela wrote based on his the work that Mandela had done on it, obviously, and lots of other books. So books from people who were on Robben Island with him, books from people who worked with him or who knew him in various capacities, journalists and so on. And then I did quite a lot of interviews. So the interviews were to get different stories that weren't in the public domain. So for example, I interviewed John Carney about the island and working on the island, and about doing that play for Mandela when Mandela was released and asked for that play to be put on especially for him. I interviewed Johnny Clegg. You may have seen that Simbonanga video where Mandela appears behind him, and Johnny doesn't see him initially, and obviously the crowd sees him. It's a very famous YouTube video. It's been seen many, many millions of times. So I interviewed Johnny Clegg about that. I interviewed people who worked in his sort of personal staff. I interviewed some journalists who were on the beat with him, and who travelled with him and so on. So different people for the part of the book that deals with the latter years, obviously post-release mostly, those kinds of interviews, and but a lot of reading.
And then how did you decide what information to keep and what to discard?
The thing about each story had to earn its keep. Each of the 100 stories, because obviously you could tell 1,000 stories about Nelson Mandela, and each one had to be sort of encapsulatable, if that's a word. So it had to be a standalone little story that had its own kind of internal coherence, and then because of the chronological nature, I had to sort of fill in certain gaps, because I felt that it should also work as a kind of an accessible, light, almost biography, if you wanted to read it that way. So I needed stories from different parts of his life. And obviously some are much easier than others. I mean, his early childhood, there's not a lot written about it, because obviously, it was a very long time ago. And then, different times of his life are very well documented. So, so it was a question of also finding a kind of a pace and a texture, where the sort of harsher stories and the lighter stories and those kinds of things, the more personal ones, the more political ones, balanced. So that's how I did it.
And when Chris Hani was killed,
Yes.
Mandela got a letter from Muhammad Ali, which was
Yes.
later auctioned off, but that wasn't the original letter. Just tell us a bit about that.
It's such a crazy story, that. So Muhammad Ali and Nelson Mandela had a very much a mutual appreciation society. They admired each other very much, and they had stuff in common, obviously, as well. I think sort of politically and in terms of their boxing and all that kind of thing. So he was, by coincidence, here on the day that Chris Hani was killed, and he wrote to Nelson Mandela, and in those days there was somebody to type up your letters. So the person who typed up the letter misspelt Muhammad Ali's name, and then he'd already signed it. He'd already signed the letter and then noticed that it had been misspelt. So the secretary or whoever it was retyped the letter and he re-signed it, but she kept the original one with the spelling error on it. And that was the one that was auctioned.
Mandela and de Klerk jointly accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, but there was some tension. Please describe how this unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very controversial thing that. I mean, there were a lot of people in South Africa and within the ANC who felt that Mandela shouldn't have accepted it in conjunction with de Klerk. And that, well, first of all, that de Klerk shouldn't have been offered it. And second of all, that Mandela shouldn't be on that stage with him accepting it. But anyway, it, as you know, it went ahead and they went together, you know, for the ceremony and so on. And at that time, each with their own sort of entourage. So de Klerk sort of took this line when he was speaking about how, you know, mistakes had been made on both sides and that kind of line. And Mandela had been, I think, much more generous and sort of, you know, given him a little bit, probably more credit than he needed to. And in return, you know, de Klerk really didn't take ownership of what he'd done, didn't acknowledge the sort of deep injustice and brutality, and sort of made it like, oh well, you know, we all made mistakes kind of thing. And Mandela was really angry about that. And he didn't show his anger very often, Mandela, and he was, as you know, one of the defining things about him was, you know, how sort of forgiving he was. But he did at the end, at the sort of last dinner, instead of reading a script that had been prepared for him, a speech that had been prepared for him at all, he said, no, don't worry, I've got this one. And all the journalists who worked with Mandela at the time, they'll all tell you that you know, the real stuff happened when he went off script, and he did go off script, and he tore a strip off de Klerk, and he said, you know, what mistakes actually did we make while you were brutalizing our people and locking us up, and so on. So yeah, so he gave him a clap, one might say.
And the relationship between the Queen of England and Nelson Mandela, at times it seems very informal. Just speak to us about that.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. I mean, one of the things that, you know, when you read about Mandela and you speak to people who knew him, one of the things which comes through all the time and right from the early days is his incredible personal warmth and his ability to really win people over. And even in situations like, as would be with the Queen, you know, very formal kinds of situations. So one of the things that the story that I tell in the book is that he was apparently the only person who called her Elizabeth other than Prince Philip, and everyone else called her, I don't know what they called her, Your Majesty or something like that. And apparently she was, you know, also completely won over by him. And the other story, which I also thought was quite funny, was when he went on this grand tour of London, which, you know, he actually just about brought London to a halt. He was so popular. I mean, he went to Brixton and so on, and, you know, they had to sort of sweep him out of there. There were so many people that wanted to come and see him and pay tribute to him and you know, touch him and see him and whatever. And so there was a concert at the Royal Albert Hall, and with various singers and bands and music and so on. And Lady Smith Black Mbaza was there, and he got up in the royal box and did his, you know, famous Mandela shuffle, the Madiba shuffle. And the Queen, who is not one who was known to boogie, apparently got up too and did a bit of a, I don't know what kind of swaying and bobbing one does in the royal box. But anyway, that was apparently the press, the British press all remarked upon that. Yeah.
Lastly, what were the most important things that you learned about Mandela from writing this book?
You know, I think for me, one of the things about reading so much about him and speaking so much about him was I was seeing it in the context of 2017, 2018, and the kind of South Africa that we were living in then and now, which is actually now is slightly different from when I started the book, because that was, you know, that was at the end of, towards the end of last year. And I think what was interesting for me about it was to think about it in context of where we are, and in context of quite a lot of sort of questioning around Mandela's role and what he did do and what he should have done. And, you know, they always say that, you know, history is an exact science, or hindsight is an exact science, I think is the term. And, you know, there's been quite a lot of criticism about the negotiation process, about things like land reform and economic redistribution around the TRC and so on. And so it was interesting to think about those things, and I think that some of that criticism, I think, is quite ahistorical and unfair on him, because when you think of where we were then, and the kind of knife edge that the country was on, and what he actually achieved, it was absolutely remarkable. It was nothing short of miraculous. And I think it's very fair criticism about, some of it is very fair criticism about the process and about particularly sort of economic justice and so on. But I think that if it hadn't been for Mandela, I really very strongly feel we wouldn't have the functioning democracy that we do have. So I think it's important to see things in context and in historical context.
That was author Kate Sidley discussing her book 100 Mandela Moments.